The courthouse hallway smelled like old wood and cleaning supplies, a sterile, unwelcoming combination that made Emma Wilson's nose wrinkle in disgust. She sat rigidly on a hard wooden bench, her small legs dangling several inches above the polished floor, her fingers wound so tightly around Bailey's leather leash that her knuckles had turned white. The golden retriever, sensing her anxiety, pressed her warm, solid body against Emma's trembling leg, a living anchor in an ocean of uncertainty and fear. 9 years old, with honey hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and dressed in her court clothes, a navy blue dress that itched at the collar and black patent leather shoes that pinched her toes, Emma looked like a tiny, frightened doll waiting to be wound up and made to perform. But inside that small body was a storm of emotions so overwhelming that even breathing felt like an impossible task. The courthouse hallway seemed to stretch on forever in both directions, lined with stern-faced portraits of long-dead judges and polished wooden doors that opened and closed with ominous finality. Each sound, footsteps, voices, the ringing of a telephone, made Emma flinch. Around her the world moved in a terrible slow motion. A bailiff walked past, his keys jingling from his belt like warning bells. Two lawyers in expensive suits discussed something in hushed tones, their faces set in expressions of professional concern. An elderly couple sat 3 benches down, holding hands and looking deeply sad. Everyone here was carrying some burden, Emma realized, but most of them seemed to know how to navigate this confusing, frightening place. She did not. She was drowning. Bailey shifted slightly, repositioning herself so that her golden head rested directly on Emma's lap. The dog's dark brown eyes looked up at her with complete understanding. Bailey had always been able to read Emma better than anyone else in her life. That was one of the reasons why she had been certified as a service dog, specifically for children with anxiety disorders and selective mutism. Bailey knew things about Emma that her parents didn't know, that her teachers didn't know, that Emma sometimes didn't even know about herself. Bailey just knew. It was like they existed in their own private language, a language beyond words. Emma had gotten Bailey 2 years ago, when she was just 7 years old. That was right after her parents had told her they were getting divorced. She could still remember that awful day when they sat her down in the living room, the same living room where they used to watch movies together as a family, where her father would make his terrible jokes, and her mother would laugh in that genuine way that made Emma feel safe. But on that day, everything changed. The room suddenly felt cold despite the warm Texas sun streaming through the windows. Her mother looked like she'd been crying. Her father looked angry but trying to hide it. "Emma, sweetheart, we need to talk to you about something very important," her mother had said, and those words alone were enough to make Emma's throat close up. The divorce itself wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was everything that came after, the awkward custody arrangements, the tension whenever her parents had to be in the same room, the feeling that she was somehow responsible for making it all better, the weight of the unspoken expectation that she would choose sides. And then came the selective mutism. Her school psychologist, doctor, had explained it to her during one of their sessions. Selective mutism, she said, wasn't the same as being shy or refusing to talk. It was an anxiety disorder where the brain essentially froze the ability to speak in certain stressful situations, even though the person wanted to communicate. Emma's brain, doctor explained gently, was working overtime to protect her from danger. Even though there wasn't really any danger, her brain didn't understand that. Her brain was stuck in survival mode, and when she felt threatened or overwhelmed, it shut down her voice like a circuit breaker cutting off power to a room. The first time it happened, Emma was in her 4th grade classroom during an open house presentation. Her father had made an appearance, and he and her mother were both in the room. Emma was supposed to do a short speech about her science project, but the moment she stood up and saw both her parents watching her, their eyes locked on her with that same tension they always carried around each other, her throat simply closed. No words would come, not a single sound. She'd stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 seconds, and then she'd sat back down without saying anything. Her teacher had tried to be kind about it, had suggested Emma try again later, but later never came. The words stayed locked away inside her. That's when her parents, despite their animosity toward each other, agreed on one thing: Emma needed Bailey. Bailey changed everything. She gave Emma a way to communicate without words. When Emma couldn't speak, Bailey would stay beside her, calm and grounded, and somehow that made it okay. The dog didn't need Emma to prove herself with words. Bailey loved her completely and unconditionally, asking nothing but her presence. Now, sitting in this cold hallway outside the courthouse, Emma felt Bailey's weight against her leg like the most important thing in the world. Her parents had argued bitterly about today. Her father wanted her to testify that her mother had poisoned her against him. Her mother had told her it was important for Emma to be honest about her feelings, nothing more. Neither of them seemed to understand that for Emma to testify at all was like being asked to climb Mount Everest while wearing ice skates. 3 days. That's how long she hadn't spoken. Not since her mother had explained what today would be like, what the judge would ask her, what it all meant. 3 days of silence, even at home where she usually felt safe. 3 days of her voice being locked away in some deep, dark place that she couldn't quite reach. She glanced toward her mother, who sat on the opposite side of the hallway, pretending to read a magazine but actually staring at Emma with eyes full of concern and love and desperate hope. Then she looked toward her father, who sat rigidly in a chair near the other end of the hallway, checking his watch every few seconds as if punctuality had anything to do with saving a family that was already broken. They didn't know how to fix this. They didn't know how to fix her. Bailey let out a soft whimper, pressing closer, and Emma finally managed to whisper, barely audible even to herself, "Stay with me, girl." Those were the only words she'd spoken in 3 days. 4 words. That was all her voice could produce right now. A bailiff appeared in a doorway down the hall and called a name, not Emma's name, not yet. But soon. Very soon Emma would have to stand up, walk into that courtroom, sit in a chair meant for adults, put her hand on a Bible, and somehow find words to explain something she didn't even understand herself. Which parent she wanted to live with. How could she choose between 2 people who had created her, who both loved her in their own complicated ways? She squeezed Bailey's leash, as if holding onto the dog would keep her from falling apart completely. The hallway suddenly felt like the loneliest place on earth. Inside the ornate courtroom, filtered sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany judge's bench. Judge Richardson sat in her leather chair, reviewing the thick manila folder marked Wilson v. Wilson, for what felt like the 100th time. She'd been a family court judge for 23 years, presiding over countless custody battles, divorce proceedings, and custody modifications. But this case, this one felt different. There was something particularly heartbreaking about it that made her tired in a way that transcended the physical. Judge Richardson was a woman in her early 60s with steel hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that had learned to see beyond words and arguments. She wore her black judicial robes like armor, but underneath, she was a person who had witnessed the collateral damage of broken marriages far too many times. Her own daughter had gone through a divorce years ago, and Judge Richardson had watched her granddaughter struggle with the aftermath. That experience had crystallized something in her, the understanding that these cases weren't just about property division and spousal support. They were about children, real children with real pain, real anxiety, real questions about where they belonged in a world that had suddenly become impossibly complicated. She pulled out the psychiatric evaluation included in the case file. The report detailed Emma Wilson's selective mutism in clinical, precise language. Selective mutism is an anxiety disorder in which an individual is capable of speaking, but is unable to speak in specific social situations. The disorder typically emerges between ages 3 and 5, but may become more pronounced during periods of significant stress. The patient, Emma Wilson, age 9, began displaying symptoms of selective mutism approximately 14 months post-divorce announcement. Current manifestations include inability to speak in classroom settings, inability to speak during interactions with her father, and near-complete verbal shutdown during stressful circumstances. Judge Richardson set down the psychiatric report and picked up the school records. Emma was a bright girl, gifted, even with test scores in the 95th percentile. Her teachers universally reported that she was intelligent, kind, and creative when she was comfortable enough to participate. But the reports also noted increasing absences, declining participation, and what one teacher had described as a visible weight she carries on her small shoulders. There was also documentation of Emma's service dog, Bailey. The certification papers were impressive. Bailey had been trained by a specialized facility that worked with children experiencing anxiety disorders and selective mutism. The dog had been trained to recognize the physiological signs of anxiety before Emma herself became aware of it. Her elevated heart rate, her shallow breathing, the tightening of her muscles. Bailey would respond by providing deep pressure therapy, grounding Emma's nervous system, and helping her through moments of acute anxiety. The certification also noted that Bailey had been trained to recognize when Emma was becoming nonverbal and would position herself in a way that encouraged physical closeness and emotional regulation. Judge Richardson understood, intellectually and emotionally, what that meant. Emma Wilson was a child with a serious anxiety disorder, and she'd found one reliable source of comfort and stability, her dog. That was a significant factor to consider in any custody determination. She turned her attention to the two sets of legal argument stacked on either side of her desk. David Wilson's legal team had submitted a comprehensive brief arguing that the father should be awarded primary custody. The argument was compelling, at least on paper. David Wilson was a successful software entrepreneur with a six-figure income. He owned a home in an excellent school district. He could provide private tutoring, therapy, extracurricular activities, all the material advantages that money could buy. His legal team had compiled testimony from colleagues describing him as reliable, structured, and goal-oriented. They presented evidence of his involvement in Emma's early childhood and argued that his stable, organized approach to parenting was precisely what an anxious child needed. The brief emphasized that Emma needed firm boundaries, consistent discipline, and a structured environment. It suggested that her mother's more permissive parenting style was enabling Emma's anxiety rather than helping her overcome it. The argument was rational. It made sense from a certain perspective. Judge Richardson could almost see the logic. But logic and love were not the same thing. Sarah Wilson's legal team had submitted a different kind of brief. Rather than focusing on financial capability or material advantages, their argument centered on emotional attunement and psychological understanding. Sarah was a licensed therapist specializing in childhood anxiety and trauma. Her credentials included a master's degree in clinical psychology and 15 years of professional experience. Her legal team presented evidence that Sarah had been the primary caregiver during Emma's early childhood, while David worked long hours building his business. They documented Sarah's professional expertise in treating anxiety disorders and argued that her psychological training made her uniquely capable of understanding and supporting Emma's emotional needs. The brief also included testimony from Emma's school psychologist, Dr., who noted that Emma displayed markedly different behavior around her mother versus her father. In her mother's presence, Emma's anxiety levels were noticeably lower. She made more eye contact, participated more in family activities, and experienced fewer episodes of complete verbal shutdown. With her father, the anxiety seemed to escalate. Doctor had written in her report, "While there is no indication that Mr. Wilson is a harmful parent, there appears to be a mismatch between his parenting style and Emma's particular emotional and psychological needs. Emma appears to thrive in environments that prioritize emotional validation over behavioral correction. Judge Richardson set both briefs down and rubbed her temples. This was the fundamental tension in custody cases. Did a child need more material security and structured discipline, or did they need emotional attunement and psychological safety? The answer, of course, was that they needed both. But when parents couldn't cooperate, when the case had to come before the courts, judges like Richardson had to make impossible choices. She picked up one more document, a handwritten note from Emma's pediatrician. It was brief but significant. Emma is a sensitive, intelligent child with a high degree of awareness regarding family dynamics. Her anxiety appears to be directly correlated with periods of conflict between her parents. She responds poorly to pressure and does well when given space to process her emotions. Her relationship with her service dog, Bailey, appears to be therapeutic and significant. I would recommend that any custody arrangement prioritize Emma's emotional stability above all other factors. Judge Richardson knew what was at stake here. This wasn't just about living arrangements or visitation schedules. This was about a little girl's sense of safety and belonging in the world. This was about which parent could better meet her where she was, emotionally and psychologically. The question before the court was deceptively simple on its surface. Where will Emma be happiest? But the answer was far more complex. Happiness for Emma wouldn't come from material advantages or structured routines. It would come from being truly seen and understood by the adult responsible for her care. It would come from having her needs prioritized over anyone else's needs. It would come from knowing with absolute certainty that her parent loved not just the idea of having a daughter, but specifically loved Emma, anxious, nonverbal, service dog-dependent Emma, exactly as she was. Judge Richardson understood that today, in this courtroom, a 9-year-old girl would have to find the courage to speak the truth about her own heart. Emma would have to tell the judge, in a room full of adults with competing interests and agendas, where she felt safe. And Emma's testimony might very well be the most important evidence presented in this entire case. She closed the file and took a deep breath. The weight of it all settled on her shoulders, the weight of a broken family, a frightened child, and the responsibility to make a decision that would shape the rest of that child's life. "Bring in the Wilson case," she said quietly to her clerk. "Let's get this started." The machinery of justice, slow and methodical, was about to move forward, and no one in the courtroom could predict where it would lead. The bailiff's voice echoed through the hallway with formal authority. "Emma Wilson. The court calls Emma Wilson." Emma's heart lurched in her chest like a startled bird trying to escape a cage. She stood on shaking legs, her hand automatically finding Bailey's leash. The golden retriever rose smoothly beside her, as if they were performing a choreographed dance they'd practiced 1,000 times. In a way, they had. Every time Emma felt the panic rising, Bailey was there. Every time her body betrayed her with trembling and shallow breathing, Bailey responded with calm, steady presence. But nothing could truly prepare her for what came next. The courtroom doors were heavy, impossibly heavy, and they swung open with a slow, deliberate creak that seemed to announce her arrival to everyone in the room. Emma took a step through the threshold, and it felt like crossing the boundary between two worlds. Behind her was the familiar hallway, a place where at least she could hide her anxiety in relative anonymity. Ahead of her was the courtroom, a vast, imposing space designed to intimidate, to emphasize the power of the law and the authority of the judge. The room was larger than Emma had expected. High ceilings soared above her, making her feel impossibly small. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that seemed to dance like tiny, mocking fairies. The courtroom was arranged in a formal configuration. The judge's bench elevated high above everything else, positioned like a throne. The witness stand to one side, an isolated chair meant for a single person to sit alone while being questioned, tables for the lawyers on either side, and rows of wooden benches in the back for observers. And in those benches sat her parents. Emma's eyes found them both almost simultaneously, as if her brain had a radar specifically calibrated to locate them. Her mother sat in the front row on the left side, wearing a modest blue dress, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Her mother's eyes widened when she saw Emma, and Emma could see the worry there, the desperate hope, the concern. But there was also something else in her mother's expression, a kind of steadiness, an anchor of calm that she seemed to be trying to transmit across the space between them. Her father sat on the right side in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Emma's entire wardrobe. He sat upright with military precision, his jaw clenched, his eyes sharp and assessing. He looked at Emma with an expression that she interpreted as expectation. He was waiting for her to be strong, to be brave, to do what needed to be done. The weight of that expectation crashed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Judge Richardson smiled from behind her elevated bench, and it was a warm smile, genuinely kind. "Hello, Emma," the judge said, her voice gentle and carefully modulated. "I'm Judge Richardson. I know this is a little scary, but Bailey can sit right here with you if that's okay." She gestured to a small space beside the witness stand. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice, and walked on wooden legs toward the witness stand. Bailey moved with her in perfect synchronization, the dog's presence providing a reassuring weight at her side. When Emma sat down in the chair, Bailey immediately settled beside her, close enough that Emma could reach down and touch the dog's warm, golden fur if she needed to. A court clerk approached with a Bible. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Emma placed her small hand on the Bible and nodded, but the moment came when she was expected to speak the words "I do," and her throat simply froze. Nothing. It was like all the pathways from her brain to her mouth had been suddenly severed. She knew what she was supposed to say. The words existed in her mind, clear and simple, but somewhere between the thought and the action the connection broke. Her vocal cords felt paralyzed. Her lips moved uselessly. Not a single sound emerged. The clerk looked at Judge Richardson with a raised eyebrow. The judge nodded understandingly. "She affirms," Judge Richardson said gently. "That's perfectly acceptable." Emma felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck and bloom across her cheeks. It was beginning already. The humiliation, the public failure, the weight of everyone watching her struggle. Judge Richardson settled back in her chair with an expression of patient kindness. "Emma, I just need to ask you some questions about your living situation and your family. Your mother and father are both here because they both love you very much, and they both want to know where you'd like to live. Isn't that right?" Emma opened her mouth. She could feel her muscles preparing to speak. In her mind, she formed the word, yes. It was such a simple word, just 3 letters. She'd said it thousands of times in her life. But this time, when she tried to push it out of her mouth, her throat closed up like a fist. Nothing came out. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Emma could feel every pair of eyes on her. The judge, the lawyers, her parents, the court reporter, the bailiff, the people sitting in the gallery. It was like she was on stage, performing for an invisible audience, and she'd forgotten every single line. Bailey's ears perked up and the dog shifted slightly, sensing the spike in Emma's anxiety. The dog's body pressed closer, providing what trainers called deep pressure therapy, the weight and warmth of another living being communicating. "You are safe. I am here." "That's okay," Judge Richardson said, still in that gentle voice. "Take your time, there's no rush." But there was a rush. Emma could feel it. She could feel her father's impatience radiating from across the room. She could feel her mother's concern. She could feel her own desperation building like pressure in a bottle. Judge Richardson asked another question. "Can you tell me about your relationship with Bailey?" Emma's lips moved. She almost had it this time. She could feel the beginning of the word forming, could sense the possibility of sound emerging from her throat. But then she glanced up and accidentally made eye contact with both her parents simultaneously. They were both looking at her with such intensity, such weight of hope and fear and expectation, and the wall slammed shut again. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. In a quiet courtroom, 10 seconds of silence is an eternity. Emma's eyes began to burn with unshed tears. Her hands clenched in her lap. Bailey pressed harder against her leg, and Emma reached down to grip the dog's fur like it was a lifeline. Her throat felt raw, as if she'd been screaming, though she hadn't made a single sound. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She wanted to run out of this room and never come back. But she couldn't do any of those things. She was frozen. Judge Richardson waited and waited and waited. Minutes felt like hours. Emma's breathing became shallow and rapid. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through her chest. This was happening. This was really happening. She was going to sit here in this courtroom, in front of her parents, in front of everyone, and prove that she was broken. She was going to prove that she couldn't handle normal things, that she was weak, that she couldn't even speak when it mattered most. The weight of failure crushed down on her small shoulders. "Emma," Judge Richardson said carefully, "would it help if we took a short break?" Emma nodded desperately, unable to form even that small word. But it was too late. The damage was done. The courtroom had witnessed her inability to speak. Her mutism was no longer an abstract concept discussed in psychological evaluations. It was a visceral, visible reality. It was there in the silence, in the tears that were now streaming down her face, in the way her small body trembled like a leaf in the wind. Bailey whimpered softly, the dog's only vocal expression of distress, and pressed even closer to Emma's side. And in that moment of absolute failure and despair, Emma didn't know what was going to happen next. She didn't know that her mother would stand up and make a suggestion that would change everything. She didn't know that the next few minutes would be the most important of her young life. All she knew was the weight of her own silence, and the desperate hope that somehow, someone in this room would understand what she couldn't say. Sarah Wilson sat rigidly on the wooden bench, her hands still folded in her lap, but her mind was racing in 1,000 different directions at once. She watched her daughter struggle to speak, watched the color drain from Emma's face, watched the silent tears begin to roll down the little girl's cheeks, and something shifted deep inside her, something that transcended the custody battle, the lawyers, the arguments, the legal briefs, and all the complicated emotions of a failed marriage. What Sarah was witnessing wasn't just a child's anxiety disorder. This was something more specific, more nuanced, more heartbreaking. She'd been a therapist for 15 years. She'd worked with countless anxious children, had studied selective mutism extensively for her professional development, had read every major research paper and clinical study on the condition. But knowing something intellectually and watching your own child experience it in real time were two entirely different things. Sarah's professional training had taught her something crucial. Selective mutism wasn't simply about being nervous or shy. It was about anxiety so overwhelming that the brain essentially locked down the ability to speak as a protective mechanism. And what triggered that response varied from person to person, situation to situation. For Emma, Sarah had come to understand over the past year and a half. One of the most potent triggers was the simultaneous presence of both parents, especially in a situation where Emma felt she had to choose between them or perform in front of them. It was a psychological insight that no custody lawyer had mentioned in their briefs. It was something that only a mother who had spent countless nights reading to her daughter, listening to her whispered fears in the darkness, observing the patterns of when Emma spoke and when she into silence, could truly understand. Sarah watched as Emma's hands clenched into tight fists. She watched Bailey press closer, trying to ground the panicked child. She watched Judge Richardson maintain her patient expression, giving Emma time and space. And then Sarah realized something that made her breath catch in her throat. Both parents being present is the problem. It wasn't that Judge Richardson was being harsh or demanding. It wasn't that Emma was being stubborn or difficult. It wasn't that Bailey wasn't doing her job. The problem was the fundamental setup of the situation. Emma was sitting in the witness stand, being asked to communicate about choosing between two parents while those two parents sat mere yards away, both waiting for her answer, both invested in what she would say, both silently pressuring her even if they didn't intend to. For a child with selective mutism, this wasn't just stressful. This was overwhelming. Sarah felt her heart racing. She knew what she had to do, and it went against every competitive instinct she had in this custody case. Every lawyer had advised her not to speak, not to draw attention to herself, to let Emma testify and let the chips fall where they would. But Sarah had never been a woman who put her own interests above her daughter's, and she wasn't about to start now. She stood up. The movement was sudden enough to draw attention. People in the gallery turned to look at her. The judge glanced over with a question in her eyes. David Wilson's jaw clenched slightly. Bailey's ears perked up, sensing the shift in the room's energy. And Emma's tear-streaked face turned toward her mother with an expression of confusion and fear. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fact that her entire body was shaking internally, "if I may approach the bench." Judge Richardson exchanged a look with David Wilson's attorney, then nodded. "You may, Ms. Wilson, but let's do this carefully. Approach without your attorney." Sarah stood and walked toward the judge's bench, of every eye in the courtroom following her. She could feel David's anger radiating from across the room. She could feel the court reporter watching her, ready to document every word. She could feel Emma's confusion and fear. But she also felt something else, the absolute clarity of what needed to happen next. When she reached the bench, Judge Richardson leaned down slightly, bringing herself closer to Sarah's level. It was a gesture of respect and accessibility that Sarah appreciated deeply. "Your Honor," Sarah began quietly. Her words meant only for the judge and the attorneys. "I believe Emma is experiencing a psychological response that isn't going to resolve itself while both Mr. Wilson and I are present in her line of sight." Judge Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Explain," she said simply. Sarah took a breath, choosing her words carefully. Emma's selective mutism is exacerbated by what clinicians call dual-presence stress. When she's in a high-stakes situation with both of her parents simultaneously, especially in a situation where she feels she must choose between us or perform for us, her anxiety becomes so overwhelming that her nervous system essentially shuts down her ability to speak. It's not defiance or refusal. It's a genuine neurological response to an overwhelming stimulus. She paused, making sure the judge was following. Judge Richardson's expression showed complete attention and understanding. "What she needs," Sarah continued, "is for that stimulus to be removed. If both Mr. Wilson and I stepped out of the courtroom, at least temporarily, I believe Emma would be able to access her voice again. The pressure of choosing between us, of disappointing one or both of us, would be lifted. She could answer your questions more authentically because she wouldn't be answering them under the weight of both parents watching." David Wilson's attorney started to object, but Judge Richardson held up a hand, silencing him. She looked directly at Sarah, studying her face carefully. "And you're suggesting this despite the fact that it might not be in your favor?" the judge asked quietly. Sarah felt tears begin to sting her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Your Honor, I'm suggesting this because my daughter's is more important than any custody arrangement. I want her to be able to speak, to tell her truth, to have her voice heard. Not because it might benefit me, but because she deserves to have her voice heard. That's what matters." Judge Richardson nodded slowly, and Sarah could see something shift in the judge's expression, a recognition of something genuine, something true in what Sarah had just said. The judge turned to David Wilson. "Mr. Wilson, I'm going to suggest that both you and Ms. Wilson step out of the courtroom while Emma testifies. This appears to be a reasonable accommodation for her documented anxiety condition. Do you object?" David Wilson's attorney whispered something to him urgently. David's face flushed with anger, but he seemed to recognize that objecting would look bad. He shook his head mutely. "Ms. Wilson," Judge Richardson said, turning back to Sarah, "your suggestion is noted and appreciated. We will clear the courtroom and give Emma a chance to speak without the pressure of parental presence. You may both return to the gallery when Emma's testimony is complete." Sarah nodded and began to turn away, but Judge Richardson's voice stopped her. "Ms. Wilson, that was a brave and selfless thing to do. Your daughter is lucky to have a mother who understands her this well." Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest. Emotion, pride, the affirmation that she had done the right thing. She whispered, "Thank you, Your Honor," and walked back to her seat. As she passed Emma, she caught her daughter's eye for just a moment. She tried to convey everything in that glance. "I know you're scared. I understand. I'm going to help you, trust me." David Wilson stood abruptly, his face dark with emotion. He walked toward the back of the courtroom without a word, his attorney trailing behind him, probably frantically whispering advice about how to handle this unexpected development. The bailiff announced, "Clear the courtroom of all observers except those essential to the proceedings." As people shuffled out, Emma watched her mother leave the room, and for a moment Sarah wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But then something shifted in her daughter's face. The immediate pressure seemed to lift. The weight on those small shoulders seemed to ease just slightly. Sarah sat in the hallway, her heart still pounding, praying that she'd been right. Praying that removing her presence, and David's, would be enough to let her daughter find her voice. For the first time since the trial began, Sarah felt like she might actually understand what it meant to truly love her daughter. Putting that daughter's needs above her own strategic interests, above her own desire to win, above her own need to be the one Emma chose. She sat in the quiet hallway and waited, hoping that her sacrifice would give Emma the gift she desperately needed, the gift of her own voice. Share Artifacts Download All Part 8 Expanded 1200 Words Document. MD Part 7 Expanded 1200 Words Document. MD Part 6 Expanded 1200 Words Document. MD Part 5 Expanded 1200 Words Document. MD Part 4 Expanded 1200 Words Document. MD Part 3 Expanded 1200 Words Document. MD Part 2 Expanded 1200 Words Document. MD Part 1 Expanded 1200 Words Document. MD Little Girl Courtroom Story Document. MD The courtroom was suddenly quieter than quiet. With the observers cleared and the lawyers temporarily excused, there was only the sound of breathing, Emma's shallow, panicked breathing, Bailey's calm, rhythmic breathing, and the measured breathing of Judge Richardson and the court stenographer. It was a strange emptiness, this nearly vacant courtroom. The ornate wood that had seemed so imposing before now just felt like walls. The high ceilings that had felt so cavernous now just felt like space. Emma sat in the witness stand, her small frame looking even more diminished now that everyone else had left. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were red and swollen from tears. Bailey remained pressed against her leg, and Emma's grip on the dog's fur had become so tight that she was probably causing the dog discomfort, though Bailey gave no indication of it. The dog simply accepted it, just as the dog accepted everything about Emma. The silence, the anxiety, the pain, the fear. Judge Richardson sat back in her chair and studied Emma with an expression of compassionate patience. The judge had been doing this for 23 years, had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing she could offer was simply time and space, and the absence of judgment. "Emma," Judge Richardson said gently, "I know you're scared, but I want you to know that you're safe now. Your mother and father have both stepped out of the courtroom. It's just you, me, Bailey, and this court stenographer here to record what you have to say. There's no pressure. We can take as long as you need." Emma opened her mouth. She could feel it this time, the possibility, the thin thread of possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could speak. But the moment she tried to push sound out of her throat, the anxiety came rushing back, and the thread snapped. "Nothing." She shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with desperation and shame. "I can't," she tried to say, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't even communicate her inability to communicate. Judge Richardson waited. The stenographer sat with her fingers poised over the keyboard, waiting. Bailey remained still and grounded, providing the deep pressure therapy that the dog had been trained to give. Minutes passed, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. In a normal conversation, 5 minutes of silence would be unbearable. But in a courtroom where everything was being recorded, where a judge was waiting patiently, where a child's future hung in the balance, 5 minutes felt like an eternity of failure. Emma felt hot shame wash over her. She was letting everyone down. She was proving all the people who thought she was broken right. She was. Then there was a soft sound at the courtroom door. The bailiff looked toward the sound, and Judge Richardson glanced over. Sarah Wilson quietly entered the courtroom, moving with deliberate slowness and minimal sound. She didn't approach the bench or try to draw attention. Instead, she walked to the very back of the courtroom and sat down in one of the gallery benches, positioning herself well out of Emma's direct line of sight but still present in the room. Judge Richardson gave Sarah a questioning look, but Sarah simply held up her hands in a gesture that conveyed, "I'm here to support her, nothing more." The judge nodded once, understanding, and returned her attention to Emma. For a moment nothing changed. Emma was still terrified, still voiceless, still drowning in anxiety. But then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Emma felt her mother's presence. Not in an oppressive way, the way her parents' mutual presence had felt before. This was different. This was her mother being present in a way that said, "I am here. I am not leaving. I am not waiting for you to perform for me. I am simply here, loving you, witnessing you, understanding you." And then Sarah did something that made Emma's breath catch. From her seat in the back of the courtroom, where she sat just outside Emma's direct line of sight, Sarah reached up and placed her hand gently over her heart. It was a gesture so small, so subtle, that the court stenographer might not have even noticed it. Judge Richardson might have missed it. The bailiff might have looked away at that exact moment. But Emma saw it. Emma felt it like a lightning bolt of love and recognition striking directly into her chest. That gesture, that was their language. It went back years to when Emma was just 3 years old and had first started asking questions about emotions and feelings. Sarah had created this gesture as a way to say, without words, that love lived in the heart, that emotions were real and valid and important. Whenever Emma felt scared or alone or sad or overwhelmed, her mother would place her hand over her heart and it meant, "You are loved. You are safe. Your feelings matter. I am here." It was their private language, their secret code between a mother and daughter. And Sarah was speaking that language now, in the middle of a custody trial, in front of a judge, with the stakes of their entire family's future hanging in the balance. Emma felt something crack open inside her, not the terrified cracking of anxiety, but the opening of a door she thought had been locked shut. Her mother understood her. Not just intellectually, not just professionally, but truly understood her at the deepest level. Her mother knew that Emma was more than her diagnosis, more than her anxiety, more than her silence. Her mother knew the real Emma, the one inside who wanted to speak but couldn't always find the way out. Emma's eyes filled with fresh tears, but these were different tears. These were tears of recognition, of being seen, of being loved not in spite of her brokenness but through it. Slowly, carefully, Emma's hand rose from Bailey's fur. She placed her own small hand over her heart, their gesture, their language, their love made visible. "I know you're here, I know you love me, I know I'm safe." Sarah, watching from the back of the courtroom, pressed her own hand more firmly over her heart, tears streaming silently down her face. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened inside Emma's nervous system. The fight-or-flight response that had been gripping her, the anxiety that had been choking off her voice, the fear that had been paralyzing her, it all began to release, just slightly, like pressure being let out of a valve. It wasn't gone completely. The anxiety was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer the overwhelming, all-consuming panic that made it impossible for her to speak. It was an anxiety that she could coexist with, that she could breathe through. Bailey, sensing the shift in Emma's emotional state with the remarkable perceptiveness that years of training and bonding had developed, lifted her head and made eye contact with Emma. The dog's brown eyes seemed to convey, "I feel it too. You're okay. We're okay." Emma could feel her throat beginning to open. The tightness was still there, but it was loosening. The barrier between her thoughts and her words was still there, but it was becoming more permeable. There was a possibility now, a thin thread of possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could find her voice. Judge Richardson, who had been watching this entire silent exchange with the keen observation of someone who had spent decades reading the subtle language of human emotion, leaned forward slightly. "Emma," the judge said softly, "are you ready to try again?" Emma looked down at Bailey. She looked toward the back of the courtroom where her mother sat with her hand over her heart. She looked at Judge Richardson with her kind, waiting expression. And somewhere deep inside her, in that place where love lived and where her mother's voice echoed with reassurance, Emma felt something shift. She could do this. Not because she was brave, not because the anxiety was gone, but because she was loved, because her mother understood her, because even in the silence she was being heard. Emma took a deep breath, the deepest breath she'd taken in days, and she nodded. She was ready. The moment the words left Emma's lips, those first tentative syllables, something shifted in the room. It was as if the entire atmosphere changed. Judge Richardson leaned forward with renewed attention. The court stenographer's fingers positioned themselves more purposefully over the keyboard. Sarah, sitting in the back of the courtroom, held her breath. But it was Bailey who seemed to understand the significance most profoundly. For the past hour, the golden retriever had been lying against Emma's leg, providing the steady, grounding presence that was Bailey's primary function. The dog had been calm but alert, her ears occasionally perking up at sounds from the hallway, her eyes occasionally tracking the movement of the judge or the bailiff. But she was fundamentally at rest, a living anchor that kept Emma tethered to a sense of safety. Now, as Emma's voice found its fragile beginning, Bailey's entire body language transformed. The dog's ears, which had been at a relaxed angle, suddenly perked forward with acute attention. Her head lifted from her resting position. Her eyes, which had been soft and drowsy, suddenly became bright and alert. Bailey's tail, which had been still against the courtroom floor, began to move, not in an excited wag, but in a slow, deliberate motion that seemed to pulse with intention and awareness. Judge Richardson, who had been watching Emma intently, suddenly noticed the dog's transformation and shifted her gaze to Bailey with curiosity. Emma herself felt the change. She felt Bailey's body tense and then shift, felt the dog rise smoothly from the floor beside the witness stand chair. The movement was graceful and purposeful, performed with the precision that comes from months and years of training and bonding. Bailey didn't leap or bound or behave with the uncontrolled enthusiasm of a typical family dog. Instead, the golden retriever moved with measured purpose, her movements deliberate and timed. Bailey took one step forward, just one, bringing her front paws onto the edge of Emma's lap while her back legs remained on the courtroom floor. It was a partial rise, a half stand, a position that the dog's trainers had specifically taught Bailey to assume at moments when Emma needed the most profound form of grounding and connection. And then Bailey placed her paw, her left paw, extended gently but firmly, directly on Emma's lap, pressing against the thin fabric of Emma's blue dress. It was the gesture, the exact gesture that Bailey performed whenever Emma had worked through an anxiety attack, whenever Emma's nervous system had achieved equilibrium, whenever Emma had moved through fear and into a state of calm clarity and readiness. The gesture seemed to communicate, "You are grounded, you are present, you are ready, I have faith in you." The timing was so precise, so perfectly aligned with Emma's moment of breakthrough, that for a second the courtroom seemed to stop breathing altogether. From the gallery, Sarah gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. The sound that emerged was involuntary, an expression of wonder at witnessing something extraordinary. The bailiff's eyes widened. The court stenographer's fingers paused over her keyboard for just a moment before resuming, as if she too had been struck by the significance of what was happening. Judge Richardson's eyebrows rose, and she set down her pen carefully. In all her years on the bench, the judge had never witnessed anything quite like this. She had read about service dogs and their remarkable abilities to sense human emotional states, but reading about it in a clinical report or a professional journal was entirely different from witnessing it in real time, in her own courtroom, during a custody trial that hinged on a child's ability to communicate her truth. The courtroom door opened slightly, and people began to peer in, the bailiff who was stationed in the hallway, attorneys who had been waiting outside, other court officers who seemed to have sensed that something significant was happening. Judge Richardson didn't have to say anything. These courthouse professionals had developed an instinct for moments that mattered, and they moved quietly into the courtroom, finding places along the walls where they could observe without disrupting the proceedings. What they witnessed was remarkable. Bailey's paw remained on Emma's lap, and the golden retriever's eyes, warm, intelligent, aware, were fixed directly on the little girl's face. The dog's body language had transformed from protective alert to something more like celebration or affirmation. It was as if Bailey was saying to everyone in the courtroom, "This child is okay now. This child has found her strength. I can feel it. I can sense it. And I am here to confirm it." Emma felt the weight of Bailey's paw on her lap like a physical blessing. The deep pressure of the dog's touch seemed to ground her entire nervous system, seemed to anchor her not just to this moment, but to her own inherent worth and capability. The anxiety was still there. Emma knew it hadn't disappeared completely, but it was no longer drowning her. It was something she could exist alongside, something that didn't define her or control her. "Your Honor," the court stenographer said quietly, "should I note the dog's response in the record?" Judge Richardson considered this for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Yes," she said finally. "Let it be noted that at the moment the witness began to speak, her service dog, Bailey, demonstrated responsive behavior consistent with her training and her bond with the witness. The dog placed her paw on the witness's lap in what appears to be a gesture of affirmation and grounding." The official documentation of this moment seemed to crystallize its importance. This wasn't just Emma imagining things. This wasn't just a mother's love or a judge's compassion or a dog's trained behavior. This was real. This was being recorded. This was becoming part of the permanent legal record of this case. Several people in the gallery had tears in their eyes now. A lawyer who had been reviewing files in the hallway and had stepped in to witness this moment was openly crying. Even the bailiff, a gruff man in his 50s who had worked in courtrooms for 30 years, seemed visibly moved. But the most profound response came from Sarah Wilson. Watching her daughter speak, watching Bailey respond with that extraordinary gesture, watching Judge Richardson's recognition of what was happening, Sarah felt something inside her crystallize. This was the moment. This was the turning point. This was when her daughter's truth would be heard, would be recorded, would be acknowledged by the legal system and by everyone present. Sarah's hand remained over her heart, and silent tears streamed down her face. Judge Richardson, her eyes never leaving Emma and Bailey, leaned forward. "Emma," the judge said, her voice carrying new conviction and authority, "I want you to know that you are safe here. You are heard here, and I can see that Bailey knows it too. Now, when you're ready, I'd like you to tell me about where you feel safest and most understood. Can you do that?" Emma looked down at Bailey's paw on her lap. She looked up at her mother in the back of the courtroom with her hand over her heart. She looked at Judge Richardson with her kind, waiting expression. And then she looked at the court stenographer, knowing that whatever words she managed to find would be recorded, preserved, made official. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but this time it wasn't crushing. This time it felt like something else entirely. It felt like the weight of truth that needs to be spoken, of authenticity that needs to be heard, of love that needs to be witnessed. Bailey's paw remained steady on her lap. Her mother's hand remained over her heart. And Emma took another deep breath, deeper this time, more steady, more full of possibility. She was ready to speak her truth. Emma opened her mouth, and for a moment nothing happened. The silence stretched, but this was a different kind of silence than before. This wasn't the suffocating silence of blocked words and frozen vocal cords. This was the purposeful silence of gathering courage, of organizing thoughts, of preparing to speak something true and real and important. Bailey's paw remained on her lap. Her mother's hand remained over her heart. Judge Richardson waited with infinite patience. And then Emma spoke. "I love both my mom and my dad," she said. Her voice was quiet, so quiet that the court stenographer had to lean forward slightly to hear her. But it was steady. It was real. It was Emma's voice, not performing, not trying to be what anyone wanted her to be, just speaking her authentic truth. "But I feel safe with my mom." The words hung in the courtroom air like something sacred. Several people in the gallery seemed to hold their breath. Judge Richardson nodded slowly, encouraging Emma to continue. "Can you tell me why you feel safe with your mother?" Emma glanced down at Bailey, and the dog seemed to understand that this was an important moment. Bailey's tail gave one slow, deliberate wag as if affirming, "Yes, tell your truth. I'm here with you." "When I can't talk," Emma continued, her voice gaining slightly more strength, "my mom doesn't make me. She doesn't try to fix it or make it go away. She just understands. She knows that sometimes the words don't work, but that doesn't mean I'm broken or bad. It just means I need time." Emma paused, gathering her thoughts. This was harder than she expected, not harder in terms of the physical act of speaking, but harder emotionally, because speaking this truth meant acknowledging something significant about herself and her family. "My mom sees me," Emma said, and her voice cracked slightly with emotion. "She sees the real me, not just the anxious me or the quiet me. She sees that I'm smart and creative and good even when I'm scared. She sees me." Sarah Wilson, sitting in the back of the courtroom with her hand still over her heart, felt tears begin to stream down her face in earnest now. Hearing her daughter articulate this, hearing Emma say that she felt seen and understood, seemed to validate every choice Sarah had made as a mother, every late night spent researching selective mutism, every moment she'd chosen to listen rather than push, to accept rather than try to fix. "And my dad," Judge Richardson prompted gently, "how do you feel with your father?" Emma's face became thoughtful. She took a deep breath, and everyone in the courtroom could sense how important it was to her to be fair, to be accurate, to honor her father even as she spoke her truth about her own needs. "My dad is great," Emma said carefully. "He's smart and successful and he loves me. I know he loves me, but he's always trying to fix things really fast. He wants to solve the problem, make it better, move forward. And sometimes that's good. But sometimes I need to just be with the problem for a while. I need to sit with my feelings without anyone trying to make them go away." She looked directly at Judge Richardson now, and there was a clarity in her young eyes that seemed far beyond her 9 years. "My mom lets me be," Emma said. "My dad wants to fix me. I don't need fixing. I just need to be understood." The courtroom erupted in a sound that wasn't quite audible but was almost palpable. It was the collective emotional response of people witnessing profound truth. One of the court officers wiped his eyes. A lawyer in the gallery shook her head slowly, as if in wonder at what she was witnessing. The judge herself seemed to pause for a moment, absorbing the weight of what Emma had just expressed. "Emma," Judge Richardson said, and her voice was thick with emotion, "that was very brave and very honest. Thank you for sharing that with me." Bailey suddenly shifted position, withdrawing her paw from Emma's lap and instead resting her entire front leg across the girl's lap in a gesture that seemed to communicate, "You did it. You found your voice. I'm so proud of you." Emma reached down and buried her fingers in Bailey's golden fur and finally let herself cry. Not the tears of anxiety and fear, but the tears of release, of having spoken her truth and survived it, of having been heard and understood. From the back of the courtroom, Sarah stood up. She didn't approach the bench or try to draw attention to herself. She simply stood with her hand still over her heart, tears streaming freely down her face, her entire body expressing the deep pride and love she felt for her daughter in that moment. Judge Richardson allowed the moment to breathe. She set down her pen and simply observed, giving everyone in the courtroom space to feel what they were feeling, to process what they'd witnessed. After several moments, the judge cleared her throat gently. "Emma, I have one more question for you if you're ready." Emma nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Bailey pressed closer, providing comfort through proximity and presence. "If you could describe what you need most in the parent you live with," Judge Richardson asked, "what would that be?" Emma thought about this carefully. She seemed to be considering not just her immediate answer but the deeper meaning behind it. Finally, she spoke. "I need someone who understands that I'm smart and good even when I'm scared. I need someone who listens to my silence, not just my words. I need someone who loves me for who I am, not who they want me to be." She paused and then added quietly, "My mom does that. My mom sees the real me." Judge Richardson nodded slowly. She picked up her pen and made a notation, then looked over the top of her reading glasses at Emma. "Thank you, Emma. You've been very clear and very honest. And I want you to know that your voice, even when it's quiet, even when it's hard to speak, matters very much. Your truth matters, you matter." Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a kind of settling, a sense that finally, after all these weeks and months of struggling with her voice, someone in authority had heard her and validated her. The judge had heard her. The judge understood. Bailey seemed to sense this shift as well. The dog's body relaxed against Emma's leg and the dog's eyes, those remarkably intelligent, knowing eyes, seemed to communicate, "You did what you came here to do. You were brave. You spoke your truth, and the world heard you." "Your Honor," the court stenographer said, "the witness's statement has been recorded in full for the record." Judge Richardson nodded. "Let it be noted that the witness provided clear, coherent testimony regarding her relationship with both parents and her sense of safety and understanding with her mother. The testimony is complete." The judge looked at Emma one more time, and there was something like profound respect in her gaze. "You may step down from the witness stand, Emma, and thank you again for your courage today." Emma stood on shaking legs, her hand gripping Bailey's collar for support. As she and Bailey walked down from the witness stand, she could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom following her. But it wasn't the oppressive weight of judgment anymore. It was the warm, affirming weight of being witnessed, being heard, being understood. As Emma passed her mother on the way toward the gallery, Sarah reached out and placed her hand briefly on her daughter's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it carried everything. "I'm proud of you. I love you. You did it." Emma placed her own small hand over her heart one more time, their private language, their secret code. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood. Love had been spoken, truth had been heard, and nothing would ever be quite the same. Judge Richardson sat in her chambers that evening, the Wilson v. Wilson file spread across her desk. It was past 5 o'clock, well after most of the courthouse staff had gone home, and the building was quiet and still around her. The late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows through her office windows, and she had a cup of tea growing cold beside her as she composed her official ruling. The decision itself was not difficult. In fact, it was perhaps the easiest custody determination she'd made in years. But the articulation of the reasoning, the way she would explain to the legal world why she had ruled the way she had, that required care and precision and honesty. She began to type. "This court finds that primary custody of minor Emma Wilson should be awarded to her mother, Sarah Wilson, with reasonable visitation rights to be granted to her father, David Wilson. The determining factor in this decision is not financial capability, not material advantages, not educational opportunities. The determining factor is the minor's own testimony regarding where she feels most understood, most safe, and most able to thrive as a person. She continued, explaining her reasoning in detail. The minor child demonstrated remarkable courage in testifying about her emotional needs and her relationship with both parents. Her testimony made clear that she requires a parental figure who prioritizes emotional validation and understanding over behavioral control. While the father's commitment to structure and success is commendable, the minor's own testimony indicated that such an approach, while well-intentioned, does not align with her particular emotional and psychological needs. Judge Richardson paused, then added a section that was somewhat unusual for a custody ruling. This court was privileged to witness an extraordinary example of a service dog, recognizing and affirming her owner's emotional state at a critical moment. The minor's service dog, Bailey, seemed to demonstrate an uncanny understanding of when the minor had achieved sufficient emotional regulation to speak her truth. This observation is noted not as a determining factor in the legal sense, but as a recognition that sometimes wisdom comes from unexpected sources, and that we would do well to pay attention when such wisdom is offered. She spent another hour crafting the ruling, making sure every word was precise, every reasoning was sound, every decision was documented in a way that would withstand any potential appeal. But more importantly, she wanted to create a ruling that acknowledged the profound significance of what had happened in her courtroom, a moment when love had made it possible for a frightened child to speak her truth, and when truth had set the course for her future. The ruling was ready by the time the sun touched the horizon. The next morning, the Wilson family gathered back in the courtroom. This time, the gallery was fuller. Word had spread through the courthouse about the extraordinary testimony the day before. Lawyers mentioned it to other lawyers. Court officers talked about it during breaks. Even the judge's clerk had apparently shared the story, because more than a few curious observers had found their way into the courtroom. David Wilson sat on one side, his attorney beside him looking grim. Sarah Wilson sat on the other side, with Emma and Bailey beside her. Emma was quieter than usual. The emotional exhaustion of the previous day had taken a toll, but there was a visible difference in her demeanor. The weight that had been crushing her seemed to have lifted, at least slightly. Judge Richardson entered, and everyone rose. She settled into her chair and opened the file. "I have made my decision regarding custody of minor Emma Wilson," she began. "Primary physical custody is awarded to Sarah Wilson, with generous visitation rights for David Wilson, including alternate weekends and 2 weeks during summer vacation." David Wilson's face flushed, but he remained silent. "The basis for this decision," Judge Richardson continued, "is the testimony provided by the minor child herself. Emma Wilson demonstrated remarkable clarity about her own emotional needs and demonstrated honesty about her relationships with both parents. Her observation that she needs a parent who allows her to be, rather than one who attempts to fix her, indicates a level of self-awareness that this court found both compelling and credible." The judge paused, making eye contact with each parent. Both parents clearly love their daughter. Both parents want what is best for her. However, in this particular case, the minor has indicated that her emotional and psychological is best served by being in the primary custody of her mother. The court has noted the mother's professional background in psychology, her demonstrated understanding of her daughter's anxiety disorder, and her commitment to supporting her daughter's emotional needs above all other considerations. She continued with specific details about custody schedules and visitation, but the key ruling had been delivered. Emma's testimony had been heard, Emma's truth had been honored, and Emma's needs had been prioritized above all other factors. As Judge Richardson completed the formal reading of the ruling, something remarkable happened. David Wilson stood up, and instead of leaving immediately or showing anger, he turned towards Sarah and Emma. For a moment his face was unreadable. Then his expression softened, and he approached his ex-wife and daughter. "Emma," he said, kneeling down slightly to be at her eye level, "I heard what you said yesterday about needing someone to let you be instead of trying to fix you." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't understand that before. I was trying to fix the anxiety instead of understanding you. I'm going to try to do better. I'm going to try to just be with you the way your mom does." Emma, surprised by this response, simply nodded. After a moment she said quietly, "I still love you, Daddy." "I love you too," David said, "so much, and I'm proud of you for being brave yesterday." He stood and extended his hand to Sarah. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. They didn't embrace or reconcile their marriage, but there was a moment of mutual understanding, a recognition that they had both been trying to help their daughter in the ways they knew how, and that sometimes being a good parent meant recognizing that someone else could meet their child's needs better than they could. As Emma, Sarah, and Bailey walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunlight, reporters began to approach, but Sarah simply shook her head, smiled gently, and continued walking. Emma held her mother's hand on one side and Bailey's leash on the other. The three of them, mother, daughter, and beloved dog, walked forward together into their new life. "Can we get ice cream?" Emma asked tentatively, her voice still quiet but gaining confidence. "Of course we can," Sarah said, squeezing her daughter's hand. "What's your favorite flavor?" "Vanilla with sprinkles," Emma said, "and maybe Bailey would like a plain frozen yogurt treat." "I think that's a perfect idea," Sarah said. They walked through the downtown area toward an ice cream shop, and something remarkable was happening. Emma was talking. Not continuously, not with the volume of a typically developing 9-year-old, but she was initiating conversation, was engaging with her environment, was speaking her thoughts and desires without the crushing weight of anxiety that had bound her voice for so long. By the time they reached the ice cream shop, Emma was humming softly to herself, something she hadn't done in months. When the teenager behind the counter asked her what flavor she wanted, Emma answered without hesitation, "Vanilla with sprinkles, please." Her voice was clear, her words were steady, her truth was being expressed simply and authentically. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her daughter order her ice cream. This was the beginning. This was the moment when healing could truly start. Not because the anxiety would disappear. Selective mutism wasn't something that simply vanished overnight, but because Emma now knew something fundamental. She was understood. She was heard. She was safe to be herself. They sat on a bench outside the ice cream shop, Emma licking her vanilla cone with sprinkles, Bailey enjoying her frozen yogurt treat, and Sarah simply being present with her daughter. No agenda, no goals, just a mother and daughter and their beloved dog beginning to heal together. "Mom," Emma said after a while. "Yes, sweetheart. Thank you for understanding me. Thank you for seeing me." Sarah reached over and placed her hand over her heart, their private language. Emma did the same, their hands mirroring each other in that universal gesture of love and connection. Bailey's tail wagged slowly, and the golden retriever seemed to smile, that characteristic golden retriever smile that seemed to say everything was as it should be. Emma had found her voice, not because she was cured or fixed, but because she had been seen, understood, and loved for exactly who she was. And in that love, she had discovered the courage to speak her truth. The courtroom drama had ended, but Emma's real healing, the slow, steady work of learning to trust her own voice, to believe in her own worth, to live as her authentic self, that was just beginning. And with her mother's steady love, her beloved dog's unwavering support, and a judge who had witnessed her truth and honored it, Emma Wilson was finally ready to face whatever came next. She was no longer silenced by fear. She was no longer invisible. She was finally truly seen. And that changed everything.